Let's talk about some of the background and history of where his ideas came from, because I think it's very important to understand the significance of psychoanalysis, his contribution to the then sort of infant stages of psychology, as well as to give him a fair assessment, judge him based on the standards of his time, rather than by modern standards where we have things like neuroscience that are sort of undeniably useful. So I think it's good to contextualize the pre-Freud era. So in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt, who was a German, set up the first psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig, and was the first person to describe themselves as a psychologist. He's kind of the person that I would go to and would say, he's the person that started psychology. Not necessarily Freud, because he came later and didn't take as much of an experimental approach. And because my background is research and, empirical observation and all of that side of things, I have a greater appreciation for that than the clinical side of things. But if you ask a clinician, they might put more emphasis on Freud. Okay,
what's the difference? What do you mean when you say clinician?
A clinician is someone who actually meets with patients and has a practical dealing with people on the ground. So to describe someone as a clinician, they meet with patients and try and work through their problems, whatever they be. They may not even be sort of emotional problems. They could be, I've had an accident and I'm having to recover with a certain amount of brain damage that affects my motor skills or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, someone in a padded room bobbing up and down. There are lots of different things, and they work quite closely these days as well with, doctors in the sort of physical health sense as well.
All right.
But a researcher can just be looking to study new knowledge or evaluating our current knowledge, checking if it's consistent with certain principles, things like that. And so the term research is actually far more broad, because you can also be a clinical researcher as well. And so a researcher encompasses everything, all of the different fields of psychology, but a clinician is very specialized because it's describing someone who's a practitioner. But you can also be a clinical psychologist who conducts research. So hopefully that's not confusing.
I think we understand, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, Wilhelm Wundt, what he did in 1879 was he defined what psychology was. He situated it between philosophy and physiology, which is very important because that's where it stayed to this day. He defined how it should be studied, i.e. the epistemology, began the tradition of lab-based experiments, and focused on empirical study, and particularly looked at things like sensory perception, which are perhaps a bit more biologically based, right? They still play into how your mind interprets things, but looking at how you actually perceive things in terms of like optics or acoustics.
And when was he around?
Well, he set up the first lab in 1879.
Oh, well, that seems to line up with the sort of time where a lot of larger scale research into the natural sciences of human biology began going on. So that makes sense that you would also want to look into the structure of the mind in that way.
I think once we had a better understanding of physiology, psychology was one of the more natural steps, because of course if you're dying of disease, how you feel about it is not necessarily as important as curing the disease, funnily enough. But sort of carrying on in a timeline, in 1881, so this is only 2 years after Wundt set up the laboratory, Freud graduated from the University of Vienna as a medical doctor. So that's a good university, and he was a doctor, which I think people actually skirt over that fact. Obviously, you couldn't be a doctor of psychology because it didn't really exist as a discipline you could study at university.
But he was trained in, would it have been medicinal practices at the time?
Yeah, he was a medical man, really. So he actually spent years comparing human brains to that of non-human animals. So his specialization was still the brain. And in fact, some of his research whilst at university played an important role. I think it was on things like nervous tissue, that helped the discovery of the neuron in 1890, or in the 1890s. And that always gets overlooked. So, he's not necessarily a slouch. That, all on its own, is worthy of remembrance without any of the other stuff.
I think this is probably where the media perception of him that I was referring to comes into it, which is that, and this is something that he promoted himself. He was famously a self-promoter within the media, and he even, as part of his psychoanalysis, set up a secret committee of psychoanalysts who began journals and communications with the media to present a particular idea, a particular picture of Freud to the world, and then with later film adaptations and featuring and things where he's featured in is things like Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud team up so that they can solve murder mysteries. That has led to this earlier part of his life being, as you mentioned, skirted over because he himself only wanted to highlight, by the looks of it, his psychoanalytic work.
It's amazing how many figures in history that we say are sort of key people in the development of our civilization that were just good at marketing, and that other people were doing similar things at similar times. And they just happened to be the most savvy at how to manipulate the media. It's still true to this day.
I mean, he had a lot of friends in the media, so...
That's true. So, in 1882, which is a year after he graduated, Joseph Breuer, who was a physician friend of Freud, of course, he knows lots of physicians, he studied, that side of things, described the case of Bertha Pappenheim, who people may know as Anna O. That's her sort of alias, because of course when you're talking about medical cases, you don't actually give people's records when you're doing a public-facing case study, because that's not ethical. Even in the 19th century, they realised that, yes, talking about people's health conditions isn't nice. But yes, Anna O is normally the thing that people who might know a bit about psychoanalysis would be familiar with. And he described this case to Freud. And we're going to look at this case study in great detail, but it's just worth mentioning that this is sort of the thing that gets the ball rolling for Freud, because it was an interesting case that we will break down. But it was from that sort of physiology world that he went into psychology, I suppose. So by 1886, he first started providing therapy. By 1896, he coined the term psychoanalysis, which is quite some years later, isn't it? It's 15 years after he graduated from university. In 1900, he published his first not his first book, The Interpretation of Dreams, which is his most famous book. 1908, the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society was formed, and they held international meetings for the first time. So you can see that it started snowballing quite quickly. Within the space of, 10, 15 years, there was already an international society. So that strikes me as if there was a first for this sort of thing. And, sort of the late Victorian era, the late 19th century, there was a sort of sea change in the culture of Europe. People were starting to read things like horror and psychological horror. People started getting interests in anatomy. There was this view of the academic man, if you will. It wasn't necessarily formalized, but there was this newfound respect for academia as developing the frontiers of human knowledge. And there's this sort of notion of the sciences finally reigning supreme, and you start seeing a growth of things like atheism, and everything had already started in motion that would create the modern world. I think that's fair to say.
Well, with all of this, I think it is also important to note that Freud himself did view at least part of his work as a form of political activism, and he was attempting to change the normative values of German society that he was operating in.
Well, he was Austrian, but it was a sort of Germanic culture, right?
He commented a lot on German ideals. And so a lot of what he was doing in regards to setting up conferences, setting up committees and doing this would have been part of his political activism, as well as purely spreading it for scientific purposes.
Yeah, and I think that he was quite aware of the marketability of his ideas because of the sort of salacious nature of some of the sexual theories. led to a lot of discussion, which led to his rise to prominence, if you will. And his focus, particularly on repression, which we'll get onto later, seems to speak of a man who was able to read the room, so to speak, of the culture he existed in, because it's certainly fair to say that in the sort of 19th century, people were sexually conservative for the most part. Certainly more so than today,
yes,
by a significant margin.
And I would argue that sea change in attitudes is partially to do with the spread of Freud's ideas, at least through the political actors who later picked them up and acted on them. They were famously influential on the Frankfurt School, for instance, who everybody who watches this channel and is on the website is surely aware of the Frankfurt School and the influence that they had on ideas going into the latter half of the 20th century, especially people like Herbert Marcuse, who explicitly said that Freud was a big influence on him and said that he wanted to take Freud's ideas of sexual repression of Western society even further than Freud did. And I would make the argument, and I think it can be substantiated, that certain level of sexual repression in a society is a good thing, because it forces people to take their energy that they would instead spend chasing tail, so to speak, doing more productive things instead.
Yes, I think you're onto something there, funnily enough. It's almost like we have a conservative podcast, isn't it? Yes. So let's get on to the psychoanalytic theory. And I think the most essential of all is Freud's contribution to understanding the structure of the human mind. And he believed that the human mind consisted of three things. So it was the conscious, the pre-conscious, and the unconscious mind. And it's worth saying that at this time, the notion of the unconscious had been proposed as a sort of formal theory, but Freud did a tremendous amount to popularize this notion. And now we know there is an unconscious mind. And it almost seems absurd to think that there was a time where we didn't believe that, at least to my psychologist's mind.
What do we mean when we say the unconscious mind, and how was it that Freud developed his idea? Was it based on empirical research? Was it based on his understanding of the human brain and the research that he'd already done into it? Or was it something that he logically thought out?
Well, it makes sense from a sort of physiological perspective, because he would be aware of the fact that there are processes that our body conducts that we're not necessarily aware of. You can't, your heart is beating, but you don't will it to beat. It's a thing that's obviously plugged into more physiological things than neurological.
It's similar to the way that you don't have to think about breathing. If everything's working properly until you start thinking about breathing, and if you just started thinking about breathing watching this, I'm terribly sorry.
You've just done it to me.
Yeah,
but
the second you start thinking about breathing, you sort of suddenly start to regulate it purposefully. But outside of that, it's something that happens unconsciously.
Mm-hmm. So there had been theories bandied about, and there's an obvious overlap here between how the body works in a physical sense and a mental sense. And so the jump between, well, there are things that are automatic and go on without our awareness in terms of our biology, but does it go on in our mind, which of course is still our biology, but just to make the distinction between the two. And so it makes sense, as well as the fact these ideas were being circulated in a small way, I suppose, but they were still controversial, and there were people denying the existence of the unconscious mind up until the 20th century. So it's kind of a bizarre thing in my mind, because it seems like the unconscious is the primary thing. It's the thing that does most of the mental work.
So Freud's ideas on this were based on the ideas that had come before it, and he was building on top of those then?
Well, yes. I think most ideas do, so that's not really a way of demeaning what he did.
No, I'm not trying to demean, I'm just trying to make it clear.
Yeah.
For my own understanding more than anything.
I think the notion of a pre-conscious was unnecessary. If I were to define, based on these categories, the human mind, I would say the conscious mind and the unconscious. And it's fair to, his idea of the pre-conscious is that it holds thoughts and feelings that can be easily brought into the consciousness. But can't you just say that there are different parts of the unconscious mind that are easier to be made conscious than others. You don't necessarily need 3 parts.
Yeah, that sounds like it. Honestly, that sounds like he was just trying to make the theory sound a bit fancier than it was.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps. But just to go over how he defined each, so we're perfectly clear, it could be a lot worse. So the conscious mind includes thoughts and feelings that are currently in your awareness. And we still use awareness as a proxy to define consciousness even to this day. We still don't know how to define human consciousness because it's such a broad concept. It encompasses so much of the human mind that if you narrow it down, you're still cutting out a very large amount of things. It seems like a very broad, spread out thing. There's not one part of the brain where consciousness is seated. There are parts that are more associated with it. For example, the prefrontal cortex.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.